You may believe staying calm around annoying people is a matter of self-control, but the truth is far more disturbing, quietly shaping how you feel long before they speak. Every sigh you suppress, every eye roll you swallow, every mental argument you silently rehearse reveals something about your mind you have refused to confront. You tell yourself it is about their behavior, their noise, their thoughtlessness, but the intensity of your reaction hints at something deeper, older, almost unavoidable. Your pulse quickens, your muscles tighten, your thoughts sharpen without consent, as if an invisible switch inside you has been flipped by something you cannot see. You imagine better responses, clever comebacks, ways to regain control, and yet the relief never comes because the trigger is never truly external. Hours later, their words echo in your mind, not because they mattered, but because your brain cannot separate their irritation from your own fragile sense of order. You feel anger, impatience, and subtle resentment, and you tell yourself it is rational, justified, necessary, and yet it feels oddly consuming, private, and inescapable. And the worst part is, they leave unchanged, oblivious, and you are left with the storm they unknowingly stirred inside you. So the question forms quietly, uncomfortably, why does their presence unsettle your inner world more than your own reasoning can explain? But to understand this, we need to examine what you believe is happening when you encounter someone who annoys you. You assume the problem lies entirely outside yourself, that the annoyance exists solely because someone is loud, careless, or irritating in ways you cannot tolerate. You believe that if they behave differently, listened better, or understood faster, your calm would be immediate, and your internal equilibrium restored effortlessly. You feel righteous in your frustration, because anyone in your position would notice the same slowness, the same insensitivity, the same mental resistance to logic. You tell yourself that your reaction is proportionate, justified, that you are only defending clarity, order, and rational interaction against careless disruption. The annoyance feels like evidence, proof of their disregard, and you frame yourself as the observer forced to manage someone else's chaos. You rehearse conversations in your head, imagining sharper responses, better phrasing, clever arguments. And this mental preparation creates a false sense of control. It feels as though if you could just communicate perfectly, you could prevent the irritation from arising, and the storm inside would finally settle. This belief comforts you because it situates the problem externally and absolves you from questioning why their presence triggers such intense reactions. You feel as though clarity and patience are tools you can wield. But the persistence of annoyance suggests a hidden resistance you have yet to notice. You imagine that your frustration is purely rational, evidence of superior comprehension, and that if only others were capable, peace would follow naturally. This narrative allows you to feel morally and mentally correct, protecting your ego while justifying the tension you carry silently. It reinforces the illusion that patience is something you grant, not something conditioned inside you over years of experience and expectation. You convince yourself that logic alone can solve the problem, that understanding their point of view will neutralize the disturbance inside, and this is where the belief starts to crack, because the annoyance often persists even when communication is perfect, revealing an unseen dimension of the mind. If this is already making sense to you, it means you're starting to notice patterns most people never see. Subscribe and let's keep exploring how the mind really works. Now, this is where things start to get uncomfortable. Slowly, a troubling realization begins to emerge, that the annoyance is rarely about their behavior and far more about how your mind interprets it and assigns meaning. You notice that strangers behaving carelessly rarely disturb you as intensely as people whose presence matters, whose opinions you secretly value, or whose attention you crave. This suggests the irritation is less about their actions and more about what those actions imply about your significance, your control, your sense of being seen. When someone close acts thoughtlessly, it feels like a personal affront, a violation of an invisible contract your mind assumes exists between you and the world. You start to suspect that what feels like annoyance is actually a response to perceived disrespect or a threat to your internal order and self-image. Suddenly the intensity makes sense, not as a reflection of intelligence or carelessness, but as a mirror highlighting your own vulnerabilities and expectations. Your frustration is less about correcting them and more about defending your internal hierarchy, the sense that your thoughts, perceptions, and boundaries should be acknowledged. You catch glimpses of this quietly, noticing the repetitive mental loops and silent arguments that arise even before the situation has fully unfolded. The weight of this observation feels uncomfortable because it challenges the story you tell yourself about rationality and self-control being external measures of morality. It reveals that some part of you secretly depends on this disturbance, relies on it to confirm competence, attention, or awareness of subtle injustices in interactions. You may begin to feel that patience, composure, and calm were never just skills but a fragile balance easily disrupted by subtle triggers you cannot control. And this is where understanding must move beyond surface explanations, because the mind has already been primed to react long before reasoning begins. From a young age, your brain learned to react when it felt unseen, unheard, or dismissed, because social survival required quick, automatic responses to potential threats. Being ignored or misunderstood in childhood often created feelings of exposure, vulnerability, and subtle panic that the nervous system encoded as urgent, automatic reactions. Your brain treats annoyance today as a similar warning signal, activating emotional and physiological responses before conscious thought can intervene or assess the situation. Heart rate increases, muscles tighten, mental energy spikes, all before you fully recognize the stimulus, as if your mind is defending something you may not consciously know. This is why your reaction seems disproportionate, why a minor irritation can feel overwhelming, and why the same behavior bothers you far more with certain people than others. Your nervous system has learned to associate certain patterns with threat, even subtle ones, and triggers an internal cascade designed to protect social presence and significance. You are not simply frustrated by noise or thoughtlessness. You are responding to a pattern, a conditioned signal that signals social risk to the primitive mind. For example, a colleague interrupts repeatedly during meetings, and you feel a surge of irritation that feels larger than the event itself. A pulse of subtle alarm. If you've noticed this in your own life, describe what happened. Someone reading may recognize themselves in it. The tension arises not from their words, but from your brain interpreting the behavior as a signal of dismissal or invisibility. A replay of old experiences. These reactions are automatic and unconscious, shaped by repeated exposure to situations where your voice or presence was disregarded, ignored, or undervalued. Even as an adult, your mind treats these patterns as urgent threats, triggering fight, argument, or mental rehearsal long before you have time to reflect. The physiological and emotional responses are evolutionary, designed to preserve social status, belonging, and perceived competence. But they are experienced today as irritation. You may not consciously want to react, but the brain's conditioning operates beneath awareness, producing the very tension you label as impatience or annoyance. And to fully see why this continues, we must examine what hidden emotional payoffs keep the cycle alive, even when it feels uncomfortable and unnecessary. Deep down, the irritation carries a quiet, almost invisible reward, a sense of mental superiority, that reassures you without ever needing to be spoken aloud. Feeling annoyed gives you a private confirmation that you are aware, intelligent, perceptive, and capable, in contrast to someone else's carelessness or thoughtlessness. This subtle payoff stabilizes your identity, quietly telling you that even in moments of discomfort, you are still in control of perception and awareness. You replay the interaction mentally, imagining better responses or sharper retorts. And this rehearsal reinforces a sense of competence even if nothing changes externally. The annoyance keeps you engaged, mentally alert, and on high definition, reminding you that your awareness and attention are finely tuned instruments. Without the irritation, some part of you would have to confront uncertainty, doubt, or invisibility, feelings the brain has learned to avoid at all costs. You notice that the moments that provoke you the most also make you feel more alive, as if your mind depends on the contrast between clarity and confusion. Even subtle annoyances provide a narrative hope. Ray, you are the rational, composed observer surrounded by chaos or incomprehension. A story that feels protective and validating. Your internal storm is paradoxical, unpleasant yet stabilizing, proving that frustration can be a form of emotional calibration, a way of measuring your own competence. The mind rewards you quietly with awareness, vigilance, and self-confirmation, which explains why letting go of irritation often feels strangely threatening. You may resist this realization because acknowledging the payoff means questioning why you have clung to discomfort for the sake of identity. And this is where things become uncomfortable, because the cycle continues not despite awareness, but partly because of it. Over time, reacting to annoyance stops being a momentary response and becomes a defining feature of how you perceive yourself. You describe yourself as someone patient yet alert, someone who notices stupidity or carelessness quickly, someone who cannot ignore what others fail to see. This identity feels consistent, familiar, and reliable, quietly preparing you to react in ways that have become predictable to your mind. Even before a situation begins, you anticipate frustration, rehearsing internal arguments, correcting imagined errors, and bracing for disruption as though it is inevitable. For example, a friend repeats a story you already know, and you feel a familiar tightening in your chest, anticipating irritation before words are even spoken. If you've noticed this in your own life, describe what happened. Someone reading may recognize themselves in it. This reaction persists not because logic fails, but because the identity itself has encoded a pattern that the mind instinctively maintains. The more you define yourself by noticing and reacting, the harder it becomes to experience calm. Because calm feels foreign to the self you know, you begin to rely on irritation as a signal of competence, attentiveness, and presence, creating a paradox where discomfort reinforces identity rather than threatening it. Arguments, interruptions, and thoughtlessness cease to be minor events and instead become mirrors reflecting familiar roles, confirming that you are who you have always assumed yourself to be. You resist letting go of this identity because doing so would require re-examining the emotional architecture of your reactions and the subtle rewards they carry. And this is where logic fails, because the mind does not change patterns that have been quietly rewarded and reinforced over years of experience. But to move beyond this, you need to see the same situations from a completely different perspective. What if the annoyance is not about them at all, but about the expectation that other minds should function like yours and meet invisible standards? You assume clarity and comprehension are universal, yet every mind interprets the world through a unique lens shaped by experience, emotion, and subconscious priorities. Their behavior is not a challenge to your intelligence or composure, but evidence of a different mental map navigating the same landscape in a way you cannot control. The gap between expectation and reality is what triggers tension, not their words, gestures, or decisions. And this realization quietly shifts the meaning of irritation. You begin to see that the mind has been trained to enforce its own rules, to seek alignment that other minds may never provide naturally. Instead of frustration, you start noticing differences, patterns, and intentions without interpreting them as personal affronts. And the emotional charge begins to diminish subtly. The irritation loses its private power over you when its cause is understood as a structural mismatch between perspectives, not a moral failure in others. You watch interactions more objectively, noting mental rhythms and tendencies without the urgent need to correct, fix, or prove anything. And this creates surprising emotional space. What once felt like a threat now becomes a curiosity, a window into the diversity of thought, the architecture of human perception, and the fragility of expectation. Your calm grows not from effort or suppression, but from recognition that mental differences are inevitable, and that trying to control them is an endless illusion. You no longer need the annoyance to validate competence, because awareness itself becomes the point of observation, not the contrast it once provided. The refrain does not erase discomfort but changes its tone, shifting from personal conflict to detached perception. And this subtly rewires emotional experience. And this is where the mind begins to relax, not through action, but through quiet understanding, allowing space where tension once thrived. You notice reactions before they fully form, a subtle awareness of the first rise of tension, the moment before irritation turns into internal argument. The familiar tightening still appears, yet it feels slightly removed, observed rather than absorbed, as if watching a wave before it crashes. You pause internally, curious about why the impulse appeared, and this curiosity interrupts automatic escalation, creating a small but significant mental gap. You begin to feel less threatened by misunderstanding and more interested in how perception varies, how minds differ, and how expectations shape emotional response. Some annoyances now pass without leaving heavy residue, and this feels quietly unfamiliar, like discovering an unnoticed room inside your own mind. You observe without needing to correct, judge, or dominate. And the experience becomes less about winning internal arguments and more about witnessing differences in perspective. The internal storm ends, and mental energy once consumed by rehearsal or correction is now available for observation, reflection, and subtle curiosity. You start to feel a calm that is not forced, not achieved, but quietly present, arising naturally as you notice without reacting. This shift is incremental, almost invisible, yet it fundamentally alters how interactions feel and how your mind carries tension afterwards. And this is where a new relationship with your own reactions begins, one that does not require conflict to feel alive. At last, you realize the people who annoy you are never the true focus of these experiences, but mirrors reflecting patterns within your own mind. Every surge of irritation, every mental rebuttal, every tightening of the chest is a signal pointing inward toward unseen expectations and vulnerabilities. You begin to see that the discomfort was never about correction, superiority, or patience, but about confronting parts of yourself you had ignored or suppressed. The moments that once drained you now fade, like quiet signals, highlighting invisible triggers that shape behavior long before conscious awareness enters the scene. You notice how easily the mind invents narratives to justify tension, how it clings to identity through irritation, and how emotional loops quietly persist. You sense compassion for the version of yourself that relied on frustration as proof of competence, a version quietly trying to protect fragile self-worth. Interactions remain unchanged, yet your perception of them is fundamentally different. And the internal storms that once lingered now dissipate with surprising speed. You realize that calm was never external, never something to be imposed on others, but a subtle awareness of how your mind interprets reacts, and expects. The mirror reflects patience, presence, and observation, showing you the mechanics of tension, and how silence within thought can be far more revealing than argument. And as this reflection settles, you notice a quiet stillness emerging inside, the kind that observes without judgment and simply witnesses. You understand now that staying calm around annoying people was never about them, but about discovering hidden loops and conditioned reactions within your own mind. Each irritation was a doorway into awareness, a mirror revealing expectations, identity patterns, and invisible rewards that shaped how you experienced every interaction. The moments you once carried long after they ended now pass more lightly because perception, not behavior, was the true source of tension. You feel a subtle curiosity growing about the unseen mechanisms of thought, about how invisible loops guide reactions across life, silently shaping experience. Watch, notice, reflect, and allow this quiet awareness to expand, letting observation replace struggle and curiosity replace agitation. And as you continue noticing, the mind begins to reveal more, layer by layer, quietly and without demand, leaving questions that only observation can answer.